Hi, this is Professor Koenig, and today I want to talk briefly about Chapter 5 in our Introducing Communication Theory textbook. And this chapter is specifically about the theory coordinated management of meaning, which is often just called CMM. So basically, the chapter starts off with this idea of like all the world's a stage, which is a very lovely sentiment. But what do we mean by that? So CMM was developed for the most part by Barnett Pearce and Vernon Cronin. And what they said about the coordinated management of meaning was that we are all sort of actors, in a sense, in our own stage play. But the problem is that we have our own scripts, but we're not really looking at other people's scripts. It's not like we're really sharing scripts word for word with somebody else who perhaps we are in the play with. But we do share a creation of meaning with the other person or people. And we share that creation of meaning through our communication, through our conversation. And the way conversations flow in a theatrical performance perhaps is very coordinated. I go, then you go, then back and forth. But that's not really the way life is, right? I don't just speak and then stop, and then it's your turn to speak and stop. And if you think back to some of these original models of communication that we talked about, that's not how communication works. And so CMM says really in conversations and through the messages we send and receive, people co-create meaning. So there's some similarities to symbolic actionism, but it's a little bit different because this is really focused on our conversations and creating meaning through that back and forth that is often not just a sender-receiver model, but situated within context, within relationships, within our various cultural situations as well. So some of the assumptions about CMM is human beings live in communication. So what do we mean by that? Communication is central. So it's always around us, it's always a part of us, we're always a part of it. We live within it, and we cannot extrapolate ourselves from a communication situation, and we can't really take the communication out of it. There's always this meaning being made with whatever conversation is going on, even if it's a nonverbal. We're still creating meaning, and we do that by this co-creation of our social reality. So there's a sort of a grander theory called social constructionism that says that people co-construct their social reality through their relationships, through their conversations. So what do I mean by that? Every day you have a conversation with one or multiple people, and through that conversation you are now creating the reality that is your relationship and the reality of the world around you. So if you get into an argument with your parent, that argument, it doesn't just disappear after you're done, right? It's like now you've created this level to your relationship where you always have this somewhere in the back of your mind, and you'll always know that, well, this is how my mom or dad feels about this situation or whatever the case may be, and this is how I feel about it. And together now we have this new feeling about it. So if mom or dad says, hey, you got to come home by midnight, and you come home at 3 in the morning and you get into a big fight about it, well, you've now created this reality. And the reality is, well, maybe you didn't take them so seriously. Oh, you're 19 or 20, midnight, that's crazy. And they expected you to come home at midnight because they asked you to. And now the new meaning might be, well, you're entering into adulthood. Maybe midnight is not really an appropriate time to be demanding you to come home. And 3 in the morning, you're grown up, you come home whenever you want to come home. And through these this conversation that happens, you've created now this new social reality. And the social reality is the person's belief about how meaning and action fit. So Our current conversations elicit new realities because we are constantly coming to new conclusions about how the other person feels, about how the other person might react. And when somebody reacts one way in a certain situation, you sort of store that information away in the back of your head and say, well, they're going to act this way again. And then if they don't act that way again, you're sort of thrown for a loop. And you have to create a new social reality and sort of construct this new social dynamic between you and that other person. Most of the time, our conversations don't go very smoothly. So it's very rare that you get into a conversation with somebody and they say exactly what you expect them to say. I cannot name the amount of times that has happened to me on any hands, as many hands. And usually what happens is somebody says something sort of like you expected them to say. And that sort of thing that they said creates this new construction and this new reality, and it builds and it grows and it grows, because remember always, communication is dynamic. It is not static. We're not just stuck with it. Okay, so there's a couple different levels of meaning. So there's your personal meaning, there's your interpersonal meaning. I really want to talk about this hierarchy because I think that's pretty important. So the hierarchy of meaning is one of the core features of CMM. And this hierarchy suggests that there's levels to what dictates our communication. So think about at the very, the largest part of this hierarchy is our cultural patterns. So when I get into a conversation, the number one thing, according to this, that is going to dictate how I talk and how I react is my culture. So I am an American. There are certain American traits. Americans tend to be very individualistic. So meaning we're kind of in it for ourselves, and that's not to say we're not in it for other people, but we tend to be very forceful with our speak and direct and things like that. So that cultural pattern is going to dictate how I communicate. I'm not going to be shy for the most part. I'm not going to skirt around the issues for the most part. I'm going to be direct and say what it is that I want to say. The next is our life scripts. So sort of moving down, this is like another really big part of how we determine our communication. So thinking a script is like think about a script in a play. Like these are like words and concepts and ideas and clusters, is the way the book describes it, of past or present episodes that create a system of meaning. So sometimes the word schema, you might have heard that before. It's like these folders of information that we file away that determine how we're okay to communicate. Think about life scripts as our autobiographies. That's what the book sort of asks you to consider. Life scripts are well, I know how my mom talks. When I call my mom on the phone, I know how she's going to communicate with me because we've done it enough times. I know how I'm going to communicate with her because we've done it enough times. These are sort of what scripts are. These clusters of information. Now, getting a little bit smaller on the hierarchy, perhaps, is our relationships. But it's still pretty big. I mean, our relationships really help determine our agreed upon communication patterns. So husband and wife, as an example. Actually, parent and child is a great example. So again, I said I know how my mom's going to talk to me because we have these scripts, but it's also a part of our relationship. So, is your relationship with your mother one of respect? Many parents and child relationships is determined, but based on and built on respect. So if that's a part of your relationship, this is like an unspoken agreement. You say, when I talk to my mom, I respect her. And so that is going to be sort of like a rule that is put into our conversation. And these things come up in episodes. So episodes are they're routines. I call my mom and she answers the phone and she says, "How are you?" And I say, "I'm doing fine, ma'am." That might be an episode. that every time I talk to her, I have this routine that I have to say, I'm doing fine. And I call her ma'am because I have this respect for her. And I am not very informal with her, perhaps. I'm very formal with her because that's our relationship. And that's an episode. They seem to follow these patterns. And think about somebody that you talk to pretty regularly. You have very, very similar patterns, and those are where your episodes are. Getting even sort of smaller in determination of how you're going to communicate is the speech act. And speech acts are a class of very familiar things such as promises, threats, insults, speculations, guesses, and compliments. Speech acts communicate the intention of the speaker and indicate how a particular communication should be taken. So a speech act is the actual act of speaking, right? But how it is perceived and how it creates meaning determines on who it is that I'm talking to. So if I said, I'm really mad at you, and I said that to my husband versus I said that to my kids, that's the same kind of speech act, but the relationship is very different. So they're going to take it very differently. And at the very, very bottom of this hierarchy is content. And the content is like this first step. Think about it as like the raw data, in a sense, like the sensory data that you sort of, you get, like, it's like the words, it's the situation, it's where you are, it's like the very basic aspects to your communication. Hi, how are you? Right? That's really basic. It doesn't really mean much until we start to build on that. Okay, now I've got, hi, how are you? That's the content. Let me look at the speech act. So who am I saying this to? How did I say, hi, how are you? Did I say it like, hi, how are you? Or did I say like, hi, how are you? That's a part of the speech act, right? Then I build into these like episodes. If every time I say, hi, how are you, I expect someone to come back to me and say, I'm fine, how are you? And all of a sudden somebody comes back to me and says, oh, you're never going to believe this, I'm terrible, blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden, like, my episode is sort of thrown for a loop, right? Well, I didn't expect you to go that way. And then I start to go build and say, well, what's our relationship? If you're my best friend and you say, oh my God, I got to tell you everything that happened to me, then that's clear, right? But if you're my taxi driver, that's sort of a weird thing that you said. I got to tell you everything that happened to me today. I would be very much confused because my life script would say, in the past, I've gotten into a taxi cab before, and the taxi cab driver has never been like, oh, let me tell you about my day today, because that's not how our culture determines conversation, appropriate conversation between taxi cab driver and passenger, right? So they're connected. So the hierarchy is delineated, but I don't want you to consider that these things happen in their own specific section. They're all connected. And they're all connected, and meaning is presented through these, what they call these loops. That Pearson and Cronin said there's like, it's these predictable patterns are like these loops. We've got charmed loops, and charmed loops, think about them as like a nice thing. Like, you know what, even if it's not the best conversation, it's a conversation that makes sense given this hierarchy, right? So I call my mom, I get into a fight with her, eventually we're going to apologize to each other, and that's sort of a charm loop, and maybe that happens all the time. I call my mom, we get into arguments, and then we make up. That's a charmed loop. It's predictable. I get it. A strange loop is when I sort of like, I don't go in a circular pattern in the way that one would assume I should. And there's a lot of work with strange loops and cultural patterns in like vicious cycles of alcoholism or drug dependency, where it's like you would expect an alcoholic to give up drinking. Well, when an alcoholic gives up drinking, I'm not saying you would expect them to, but when an alcoholic decides, I'm going to give up drinking, you expect that once they give up the drinking, that's good, and then they go on with their lives in other ways. But what tends to happen is they realize that they can do it, and so the very next thing that they do is go and have a drink. Oh, I've got control over this, so I can drink. And then you lose control again, because if you have a problem with alcohol, you lose control. And it's like this loop that shouldn't happen. Because you should have just said, well, I'm done with drinking now. Why would I pick up a drink? But that's a strange loop. I hope that makes sense. The last thing I want to touch on, because I don't want to talk for too long, are the coordination. So coordination is like making sense of the sequences. And it's like a process. So coordination requires people to be involved in the process, to care about the process. It's influenced by several issues, a sense of morality and the available resources. Our social worlds are essentially moral places that prescribe we should act and the resources we should draw upon to live other lives with dignity and honor. So if somebody apologizes to me, the coordinated process would say that I would be like, it's okay. And we have this sort of back and forth. But that doesn't always happen, right? I mean, that's not like that's that has to happen, that we're forced to accept somebody's apology. So sometimes there's inconsistencies in our coordination, or inconsistencies that lead to difficulties in our communication. And sometimes it's because of resources. And a resource is really like, it could be a symbol, it could be an image that people use to make sense of their world. So coordination could be influenced by resources available to the individual. Resources refer to the perceptions, the stories, images, symbols, and institutions a person used to make their world meaningful. Resources also include perceptions, memories, and concepts that help people achieve coherence in social realities. So they vary. Our resources, they change depending on who it is that I'm talking to. So education might be a resource, right? You are all in school and you all have education. But maybe this is a resource that some members of your family don't have. And so when you go to your grandma's house, you sort of don't talk about school all that much, because it feels like you're being one up in your grandma or something like that. So we have these resources, but we don't always access them when we're trying to coordinate our conversations, and we're trying to coordinate our our compatibilities. And a lot of that also is tied to rules. So rules within our relationships, rules within our intrapersonal rules, cultural rules. Two specific rules that exist in CMM are constitutive and regulative. Constitutive rules organize behavior and help us to understand how meaning should be interpreted. Regulative rules are guidelines for our behavior. So constitutive rules, again, if somebody said, I love you, it has very different implications based on who you said that to. Or if you say, hey, how are you doing? That also has very different implications. When you're trying to coordinate and understand and make meaning out of your communication, there's a lot at stake. And that's really at the heart of this theory. You can't just say, you said, I love you to me, and I understand what that means, because it could mean 800,000 different things depending on all of these little pieces that make up this theory. Yeah, this is not an easy theory, because communication is very challenging. But one of the things about this theory is that it's very highly respected. So in the last chapter, we said there's a lot of critique of theories. This theory, there's certainly critiques of it, but it's also used very widely, and it has been very, very often used to build upon other theories. It's a heuristic theory, which means that it's used to build in different content areas. It's used to make meaning. it's a pretty important theory in communication. So I hope that that was helpful to you. If you have any questions, let me know.